thank you very much for coming. I'm Jill, for those of you who don't know me. I direct Pavilion, which is a visual arts organisation based here in Leeds. We focus on producing new works of art with contemporary artists. So it's great to be collaborating with the University of Leeds on the first of 3 events that are really aiming to circulate some of the ideas that are framing the Istanbul Biennial this year, the 14th Istanbul Biennial. So there are 2 connections to Istanbul, between Istanbul and Leeds this year, which we're wanting to pull out through this event. Firstly, Griselda, who I'm sure many of you know, teaches at the School of Fine Art, History of Art and Cultural Studies at the University of Leeds. And Griselda has been invited to be part of a small group of what's been called alliances, artists, curators and thinkers who are assisting Caroline Christoph-Bakagiev with her drafting of the 14th Istanbul Biennial, which launches in September this year. And some of you will have attended Caroline's lectures at the university last year, which were thinking through her work with Document 13, so it's great that this connection continues. And secondly, we at Pavilion are working with artist Grace Schwint, who will be showing, as part of the Istanbul Biennial, in the Museum of Modern Art in Istanbul. So it's very exciting to have these 2 connections. Just a little about Grace, by way of an introduction. We began our conversation, I guess, a year or 2 ago, didn't we? In relation to Grace's recent film, Only a Free Individual Can Make a Free Society, and some of you might have seen that at Sight Gallery in Sheffield recently. It's actually opening at Tramway in Glasgow on the 1st of May, if any of you are up that way then. In the film, Grace combines dance, costumes, props, sets, and a dialogue with a political activist turned taxi driver to question how freedom was and is understood, who has access to it, and what political and social structures need to be in place to create a free society. Pavilion's contribution to the project was the production of an event at the Hyde Park Picture House last year, which some of you may have come to. In the late 19th century, before the advent of radio, telephone lines enabled audiences to listen to live performances and concerts. This was known as the pleasure phone. And this was kind of part of our early conversations with Grace. And in the event, Grace used this kind of rudimentary method of communication to connect our cinema audience to a one-off performance choreographed in an empty theatre, based on a passage from the film, and featuring a dancer and a text prepared by Bridget Crone. The event interrogated ideas of liveness, detachment and community as they relate to the body of both performer and spectator. And these ideas, among many others, will be kind of taken up by Grace in her new work that we're producing together, that takes as its starting point the maritime industry of the Shetland Islands. So Grace is going to expand on this in her presentation. But first of all, I'll hand over to Griselda, who will talk about Istanbul and some of the work that she's doing in preparation for the biennial.
Well, I'm very, very grateful to all of you to have given up what could have been a sunny afternoon, but I hope is getting colder and wetter and windier, so you're not going to be missing the few days of summer that we might have had to come to an event here, which is, as I say, collaboration with the Pavilion, but also thank very much to the Tetley for providing us with the space, and we're going to be collaborating with the space in due course. So what I'm going to do is just to give you a little bit of a framework for why on earth there would be Istanbul and Leeds and Istanbul in Leeds, because this may well perplex you, and explain something about the nature of these exhibitions and the events that are going on. So I'm going to be in conversation really with Grace in due course, but I'm going to give you an introduction at the beginning here. So we're going to start with this question of, this is the logo of the cultural organization that organizes a biennale in Istanbul. This year it's going to be curated or directed or drafted by a woman called Caroline Christoph-Bakagiev, who is an Italian Bulgarian born in America, but has become one of the most influential of people in terms of making exhibitions that engage very profoundly with major theoretical, philosophical, historical, scientific, as well as artistic questions. So that she is someone to watch, and it will be in Istanbul, but she has proposed this theme, salt water, a theory of thought forms. So that immediately makes absolutely clear as day to all of you exactly what you're going to find in the exhibition. So what does it mean for your curator to, as it were, organize an exhibition not about an artist or a theme or a movement, but with some kind of provocation in the concept? So what we have to think about for this project is why are we going to think about Istanbul this 25th of April, 2015. Why would there be any connection between Istanbul and Leeds? Well, Jill has already indicated that there is a way in which, because Caroline Christoph Bakagiev was the visiting professor at the university last year, we formed a certain kind of conversation which is carrying on now into the next project that she's doing. So she came to Leeds and Leeds comes in. That kind of explains why I'm involved. Why Grace? Grace is involved because of that connection through the pavilion, working with her, but also indicating to Caroline Christoph Bakagiev, here was a remarkable artist whose work might fit in with this larger concept that she's putting forward. And therefore, why the pavilion and Tetley? Well, it's because part of the project of having a big exhibition, which has often an outreach program or an education program, is to take things that might happen in the studio or things that might happen in the university or things that might happen in a scientist's lab, these very specialist places where people undertake research at the kind of far ends of knowledge, but there isn't actually a public who's interested, who wants to have some ways in, some doors open, some keys offered to enable them to engage with what it is that both the artists are doing and that the person drafting a show like this is thinking in terms of bringing them together, putting them into the world as something, asking people to come. And it's very important to grasp this because at a certain stage, if you were thinking probably under the rubric of modern art, you would think of quite a sort of select audience of people who go to museums of modern art. Once the Tate Modern and various other expanded ways of doing, institutions have grown up, there is a growing interest, a growing expansion of the conversation between artists, the people involved in curating and showing art, the people analyzing art, and also public. So we've seen a shift. If you think the Tate Modern opened in 2000, only 15 years ago, that here where you have, millions of people going to it on an annual basis, whereas the sort of traditional, even modern Museum of Modern Art would have been pretty happy with 250,000 or maybe 500,000 a year. So there's really been a sea change in terms of whether this is something that lots of people are interested in. And of course, Leeds does not have a major museum of modern art, and it hasn't had a centre for contemporary art, such as the Blue Coats in Liverpool or the Corner House in Manchester. So the Tetley and the Pavilion are our major drivers of building up conversations, bringing people together, creating an environment in which we can come together to talk about art, given that there are 3 art schools or 3 schools of fine art in Leeds alone. There's another one in Huddersfield. There's quite a community here. So we wanted to think about why these things. Now, I'm going to talk about one recent event that took place in London, which is part of this project. There are 2 further events to lure you to. One is on Wednesday, the 20th of May, which will take place at the university, and I'll explain these afterwards. And then another, which is in conjunction specifically with the Tetley, on Wednesday and Thursday, the 3rd and 4th of June. One evening, one afternoon event. So if you are hooked on this, I hope you'll be kind of part of the project for the next 2 months. Now, the way I was framed that which I was asked by Caroline Christoph Bakagiev to come up with was the idea that we should prepare people in advance of the exhibition. Usually you go to an exhibition and there may be an education program there, but why would people go? And even if you can't go, you might be interested in how it's actually emerging. So I proposed an in-advance program to meet with different kinds of publics, which was going to be a combination of making with, i.e. talking to artists who are in the process of making work, because for these big exhibitions, artists are not just showing work they've already done, they're frequently creating projects specifically for the location, for the theme, or as part of an intersection between what they're working on and how this theme is intersected. So we need to have a thing of making with, but also there is a reading with, because there are ideas and thoughts and even quite kind of complicated things lying behind some of the work by artists and some of the framing that are something that one might work formally in a classroom with, but why shouldn't the general public have a chance to engage with some of the kind of intellectual currents? So these are the two themes. So today is a bit like, is the making with, but these are the two artists whom I've recommended will go to the Istanbul Biennale. So I'm working sort of in a kind of sub-curatorial way on this artist I'll talk about, and Bracha Ettinger, who will be the artist who will come to Leeds on the 3rd and 4th of June, both to talk about what she's making for the show, but also for us to have an opportunity to read with her. Okay. So what is a biennale if it's not a biennial? Okay, most of you, if you're gardeners, well, that's what you'll think a biennial is. It's a plant that at least grows for 2 years or comes every 2 years. But of course, we're talking about something else, partly from the Italian biennale, which just means every 2 years. Now, it's just amazing. And I want to show you this. This is how many biennials or triennials or other kinds of shows of this order which will happen just in 2015. So people looking at this are talking now about what's called the biennalization of culture, whereas it was a relatively small phenomenon. I'll explain the history in a moment. Now it's absolutely the major platform. Every city has to have one. Liverpool has one, you know, every Berlin, Paris, and you can see them in the Urals. Here's the Istanbul. You can see them, I picked up the Havana Biennale happens this year, the Venice Biennale, the Biennale of the Americas. You can see one in Turku in Estonia, one in Sharjah in the Arab states. Where was I thinking? I also put up the Gwangju Triennial, which happened just last year, in which the artist Lubena Himid, who's one of the founders of the Tekli, was shown. Now, the first Biennale, why we call it a Biennale rather than Biennale, was in Venice. So we start in Italy in 1895. So, you know, this is, 120 years ago. And you can see that it happened across the summer, April to October. And if you look at Austria and Hungary, still the Austro-Hungarian Empire was there, Belgium, Denmark, France, England, Germany, Italy, Holland, Spain, Russia, and Sweden and Norway were the founding countries. So it's a really interesting map. You know, nothing in, I suppose everything in Eastern Europe got taken up as Austro-Hungary, but these were the powers in 1895. And the model of the Venice Biennale still reflects that notion that this is about different countries coming to one place and showing off their art. So it's born in the age of empire, born in the age of nations, and so these are now the pavilions that are in the giardini, in the gardens, but all over the city now are pavilions because every year another country gets its place in one of the palazzi. But you can see it's a much broader thing in countries that didn't exist. Serbia has emerged again, Estonia, the Ukraine. I think if there's anything else that you can see, but this is all teaching you Italian as well. But when Venice was founded, it was like any other big exhibition. So this is a salon, and mostly are paintings, and then there'll be a few sculptures. So compared to what we have to encounter, which is going to be, performances, video pieces, sound pieces, piles of, garbage, dogs wandering around, all sorts of things that you can do now, we can see how far we've come. And the current Venice Biennale, the 56th, is going to open in about a week's time. curated by Okwi and Wezo, a Nigerian curator now working in Germany. And his theme is all the world's futures. So this idea of having a thematic as opposed to a national thing is part of what the change that has occurred. And he is going to, you can look it up and see. Now, the second, after 1895, nothing happens. Obviously, terrible things happen after 1895. 2 world wars catastrophically destroy Europe and reconfigure the maps. So interestingly, the second Biennale was in Brazil. So we move right from the heart of Europe and the kind of European nations to Latin America, pushing its place, a brilliant continent in terms of engagement with modernity and modernism that has sort of probably fallen a bit off most people's map, but they were number 2. Sao Paulo, a fantastically interesting city, typical of Brazil, extremity of fantastic skyscrapers and the sort of huge bursting modern city, and the slums that side by side. The third one was in Havana, now in Cuba. So it is in a socialist, in a communist country in the Caribbean. And it was founded to enable the artists of the Caribbean and Latin America to be visible on an international art stage. It's now extended to Africa and Asia. But the heart of this is to contest Europe's hegemony, the idea of European American as the sort of only place where great art is made. So it's really bringing the South to its own biennale and has its own politics. And the fourth is Istanbul. So it's very, very important the Istanbul Biennale is in this history. It's not just one of the new ones popping up. It's actually the fourth in the world. And it is organized since 1987. And they have a particular way that they went against the national representation model, that they would have an international advisory board, ask for a conceptual framework according to which artists and projects are invited to be part of this exhibition. So now you have to indulge me. Do have a rest now and sleep if you want, but I am a historian, so the minute anybody gives me a chance to tell stories about the past, I leap at it. But the crucial thing about Caroline Christophe Bakagiev as a curator or as a creator of exhibitions is that the first thing she pays attention to is place. Now, why is this important? Because in this huge international art world that exists now, it's perfectly possible to go from one Radisson Blu to the next executive lounge, to the next, possibly first class, maybe only business class. The artists are always in steerage, to another Radisson Blu somewhere else, and travel in the kind of supersphere of international travel, never touching down, but just inhabiting this so-called international art world in which artists appear in different parts of the world, but it's more or less the same. Now, Caroline Christophe Bakagiev's deep sense of the sort of political and ethical urgency demands that the first thing she does when she gets a commission like this is to ground herself in the place. So I need to ground you also in Istanbul because it's so interesting. Okay, so Istanbul was Byzantium, Constantinople, Stromboli. So we have to go back to the Romans, first of all. So it was called Byzantium, and then it was changed to Constantinople when the Roman Emperor Constantine made this the capital of the Roman Empire. He moved the center of the Roman Empire from Rome all the way to the east, and here he is, looking extremely stern. That seems to be the only head we have of this great man, etc. And as you can see, the other reason he's remembered is that he Christianized the Roman Empire. He decided either Judaism or Christianity, and he thought Christianity would do better. So he took on that. So as a result, he is a famous figure in the history of Christianity and in Byzantine art. You can see here, this is Constantinople in the Byzantine period, really only on the left-hand side of the Bosphorus. But because he's such a Christian figure, they've put up a statue to him in York in 2008. So when I saw this, I thought, that's an amazing kind of piece of Roman sculpture. York? No, it's a recent by, I think it's called Philip Jackson, but it's exemplary of this recuperation. Now, the Roman Empire lasted until 1453, so just before the discovery of the New World, just get you in the right century, in the 15th century, when the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans came from the east and conquered and defeated the Roman Empire, and Suleiman the Magnificent is one of the most famous of their rulers in the 16th century. So he is a contemporary of Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I, right? So you've got your sort of sense of what's happening in the world. And here is a painting of Suleiman, probably by Titian. And there's an amazing exhibition on at the moment in Brussels, actually suggesting that much of the Italian Renaissance is inspired by the effects of this Ottoman coming to take over things. So anybody going to Brussels for an away day or a week break in the next few, do go to it, etc. So here we have Suleiman. And of course, this then Islamicizes Constantinople. He goes from being one of the great capitals of the Christian world to being one of the great capitals of the Muslim world. And this is the mosque that Suleiman built right on the top of the hill. And this is the extent of the Ottoman Empire. So you have to grasp, when we think, even when these young boys go around thinking about the caliphate, you know, this is their memory. It's only 500 years ago that this is it, from Algeria through Tunis, through Morocco, through most of the Sudan and all of Egypt, all the way down the this side of the peninsula down here, all of the Middle East, Syria, Jordan, right the way down to, here's the Red Sea to there. And then you've got Turkey, what we have here, Anatolia, most of the Ukraine, the Crimea, all the way up into within spitting distance of Vienna, right? So when you put the countries in, you can see this and why there is such an Islamic presence, a Muslim presence in Europe, right, particularly through the Kosovo, Serbia, you know, all of that element of that, and right the way through to Baghdad, down to the Persian Gulf. So all of Iraq and Iran, Azerbaijan, right the way to the Caspian Sea, an extraordinary event. So it retreated a bit by the 17th century, and then 1914, when it really hits our history, it's come back to being mostly this whole area. Now, this is very crucial, obviously, because there wasn't a Palestine, there wasn't a Lebanon, there wasn't a Jordan, there wasn't a Syria, there wasn't an Iraq, right? At this point in time, that was all created when the empire was defeated. And what you could say, what we're watching now, is the unraveling of what was set up at the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, when all these countries were divided up between the victors, because the Ottomans sided with Germany in the First World War. Okay, so we've got that legacy. But many of you who have been listening to the radio this week will know that two big issues have come up, bringing Turkey back into the conversation amongst the chattering classes on the radio, Radio 4 and others, which is that this is the anniversary year of what is known by the Armenians as the genocide, the Armenian genocide, the first mass murder of civilians. This is the origin of it in April 1915, when the intellectuals of the Armenians were rounded up, taken off, imprisoned, and many of them killed. And then the claim is that the civilians were driven out from their enclaves because, of course, the Armenians are the remains of the Christians from the previous empire, and they were all in the eastern part, which is now Kurdistan, and they were driven out into what's here, the deserts of Syria, to starve to death. Now, Turkey doesn't take responsibility for it. It says some military people committed some massacres and they were tried, but they didn't plan it. So there's a major issue there, okay. But at the end of the Ottoman Empire, we get the word Young Turks. Has anybody used the word, it's in our British vocabulary, Young Turks, for anybody who's a bit, getting up. But there was the movement. So they overthrew the caliph, they put in a constitutional monarchy, and then the modern Turkey is founded by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who is, like many of the people who came in post-World War, engaging with modernization, Western values. He changed the script of Turkish writing from being a kind of Arabic-type script to being a Roman script, so you can at least read it, even if you cannot interpret it or make any sense of it. And he established, as you can see, he's dressed in modern style. But the most important thing is he founded an art gallery. Of course, because in Islam, you wouldn't have sculpture and art galleries. You might have all the kind of culture around the mosque. But that was the sign that he was really saying we are part and parcel of going back to being part and parcel of the Western world. And with dress, I just wanted to show you the difference between the traditional fez of the Turkish gentleman. He wore a Panama hat, and the fight over the question of unveiling women, which he insisted on unveiling women. But here is the present president of Turkey, the problematic Erdogan, and Mrs. Erdogan, who is going back, undoing Mrs. Ataturk's thing. So this is a huge series of debates that carry on. The city not only has its Roman architecture and its beautiful Islamic mosques, but it is the center of an enormous Art Nouveau movement, which is one of the things that Carolyn has picked up. It has a very distinguished architect, and there's an extraordinary, so you don't have to go to Brussels or Paris to see, or even to Barcelona. This you can, if you've done that, you can do another Art Nouveau visit to the streets of Istanbul. Modern, obviously, and I'm moving on here. This is a shopping mall that's planned for Istanbul, and obviously even more sci-fi elements of it. So the crucial thing that anybody dealing with this and thinking about putting an art exhibition in Istanbul confronts is that Turkey straddles Europe and Asia, historically in these different ways, and now, because Turkey, as you know, is applying to join the European Union, which will extend Europe into the Asian continent, make it literally boundaried by Syria and Iraq. And obviously, we'll see, because it's the Black Sea, and it's between two seas itself. It's a waterway. The Bosphorus runs between it. It's got two seas, the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara. And the issue of its easternness or its westernness, its Christianness, its Muslimness, Islamicness is very profound. The city now actually has its own waterways and the Golden Horn. But also, when you look at it under the larger thing, this is so fascinating now. And I know this is probably not as fascinating to you as it is to me, but geography is my other passion. Okay, but if you think, who thought about Yalta since 1945? Who thought about the Crimea since, the 1850s until Putin went in and sort of took it back? There's Ukraine, there's Odessa. But if you just imagine this world, Trabzon, Odessa, Istanbul, then the narrowness of the Bosphorus that leads into the Sea of Marmara, and then we have to take on board, before we get into the Aegean, into the Mediterranean, is we get to the sea, and this strange little piece of land there, which of course is the Gallipoli Peninsula, which of course is what we all marked yesterday, the beginning of the assault and the massive loss of life. But you can see why they were trying to get the Gallipoli, because if you don't have that peninsula, you can't control the Dardanelles. The Russian fleet can't get out from the Black Sea to the Aegean, and the Ottomans can stop them up and also control the Aegean. So this is what it is. Whereas now, modern Turkey is just a little bit in Europe, bordering Bulgaria, but now we have its Syrian borders and Iraqi borders, and so we're also in another completely complicated political system, which is even more complicated than when it was announced that Carolyn Christoph Bakargiev would put things. So should we all go to Istanbul? Is it safe for any of us to be there? So, okay, let's move on a little bit. Okay, but obviously we want to go because it's just an astonishing city to see. So you can maybe begin to see how you would come up with the concept of salt water. Why you would have to say the central thing you have to think about is to do with movement, with water, with passageways, with all the implications that come from it, whether it's, this is the first bridge built across the Bosphorus very recently, the great shipping routes that go through it, the great sense of its relationship to water. So if we look at what Carolyn has actually explained in her publicity, in her press release, she is promoting her exhibition as with and through art we commit ourselves to the possibility of joy and vitality, leaping from form to flourishing life. Saltwater, a theory of thought forms, the 14th Istanbul Biennale, looks for where to draw the line, to draw upon and to draw out through organic and non-linear processes that reconnect the most advanced researchers in brain studies, bioscience, environmental studies, and art today, with the history and driving forces behind the development of Art Nouveau in 19th century architecture. It does so offshore, but on the flat surfaces with our fingertips, just like here, but also in the depths underwater before the enfolded encoding unfolds. This international exhibition of contemporary art will be by over 50 artists, visual artists and other practitioners, including oceanographers, botanists, storytellers, neuroscientists, in a citywide exhibition on the Bosphorus that considers different frequencies and patterns of waves, the currents and densities of water, both visible and invisible, that poetically shape and transform the world itself. The 14th Biennale of Istanbul hovers around the image and meaning of waves, literal waves of water, sound, invisible waves like radio waves or other electromagnetic waves, but also waves of people, waves of emotion and memory. Perhaps a wave is time. The feeling of a difference between the high and the low points of a wave marks the experience of time and thus of space. And through the identification of waves and the seeing of waves, that we acknowledge fundamental patterns, underwater patterns of water or patterns of the wind. Waves and patterns are both literal and metaphorical, and refer also to the waves of history, the waves of insurgency, waves of outrage and commitment, when a people decides to aggregate, to come together, to draw the line, to draw out, or even to withdraw. So that's very, very typical of the way in which Caroline Christophe Bakagiev tries to, I think very elegantly, move you between the sense of what is the material physical world that we tend to be abstracted from, leave it to the scientists, ignore it in the arts field, think we can just think with our minds or bodies, but actually what is the ground of our work, the ground of our lives, how much are we part of this physical universe, but also we move through these sort of possibilities of metaphor into the field of politics, into the great sense of the aggregations of people, but also into subjectivity, into waves of emotion, and the necessity to try and hold these together in a way of writing, which of course is what frequently artists do, why we like art, because it holds things together, not in a linear fashion, but in a way that perplexes us in certain elements. Now, I'm going to just tell you very quickly about why, therefore, I felt that this artist, Christine Taylor Patton, could be important. Now, I know about Christine Taylor Patton. Some people know about Christine Taylor Patton, but not enough of the world does. I specialize, as you may know, in a certain fidelity to the fact, or the idea, that women actually make a difference in the world and that they should be included in the world and in the world of art. But for so many very complex reasons, some of which we do not fully understand yet, you can be in the world side by side, making art, as any of you who are studio students will know, side by side with people, and then you wonder why this person rises to the surface, soon becomes one of the kind of great names, has huge price tags, while the person sitting beside them is less known, not taken up, doesn't have a dealership with Hauser and Wirth, Gagosian, the big players that determine things, etc. Now, is it a matter of our believing that there is a spontaneous choice about value or quality, or is it that we're watching the constant playing out of a kind of selective imaginary which makes it less and less possible for women to simply take their place? So I'm not recovering or rediscovering, I'm just pointing out there is a way in which certain artists get found left at the margins, and some of the opportunities that come my way because of this theme have been to allow them at least a moment to be in this international stage. So in the preparation for this, we had a show in London with a co-curator of mine, a colleague of mine, Adriana Czerny, in her gallery in London called the Leiden Gallery, and we showed a kind of mini version of what is going to come to Istanbul through Christine Taylor Patton's work. And what you have is a combination of a 9-foot drawing here, but it will be 24 feet, which is 7 meters, a single drawing that is 7 meters by 4 meters, which has taken 12 years to produce, which will be in the same combination between the micro, which is 2.5 centimeters by 2.5 centimeters, or 1 inch by 1 inch, set against something which is 7 meters, which uses exactly the same gesture to make it. It's composed of a crow quill pen, hence an organic feather that is made into a pen, an ink, which is an organic ink, so that's the central move, and then the movement of the hand, which composes this. And she has created 2,000 drawings using that particular format called the micros, each of which is an effect or a conversation with what has happened in the previous drawing. So there's no plan, there's simply a dot that splits, and from that comes potentially every possible thing that a stroke on paper in black and white can produce. So sometimes the images become cosmic, sometimes they look as if they've come from constructivists, sometimes they look as if they're entirely sort of hilarious, like a dancing, sort of like a physical experiment where you just see light dancing around. Sometimes they are more, as I say, cosmic here, or other times they're going to be entirely, they don't blow up very well, abstract. And I just want to show you another show of hers to give you some sense of why I think this is an extraordinary exhibition. These aren't going to Istanbul, around the question of to draw, drawing a line, the question of what actually happens when you do. So I'll show you these silently. So these are 8 or 9 foot drawings. And she also showed the micros. The question for Istanbul is how to show them. So originally we wanted a space which would have taken most of the Museum of Modern Art for the 24-foot drawing and 1,000 of the drawings in a spiral. The reality of life is that if you don't have Hauser and Wirth prepared to give you $1 million to do it, you'd end up with a different space that you fight with. Now, the other line of stories I want to just introduce before we have a little coffee break and before we listen to Grace's talk, is the question of storytelling. She mentioned that there's both the line and the waves, but also storytelling. And this, I'm going to introduce a quotation that I've used in my own contribution to this from Karen Blixen. When I found this, I thought I had a theme, because she writes, "The cure for anything is salt water, sweat, tears, or the sea." So while we've been focusing on the Bosphorus and the sea and the passages, it's important to remember that the two crucial elements of our bodily liquids are salty, our sweat, and we weep salt tears. And I find that very fascinating because, again, it brings this question together. So this is just what I've written. From the vastest oceans to our intimate bodily secretions and the fluid that lubricates our vision while watering our emotions, salt water is a natural antiseptic that heals our wounds. It cannot, however, sustain our thirsty human need for fluid. We would die from drinking it instead of fresh water. Covering the vast surface of the planet from whose depths the earth on which we live erupted, the oceans are the ancient surfaces of transport and connection, while they lap at the shores that form the limits of many an island or continent. The intimacy of the city of Istanbul with 3 seas, with salt waterways that flow through narrow straits, with its own narrow water passage that bifurcates the settlement and joins 2 of the great continents, historicizes and politicizes the salty water that defines our planet. Against this defining feature, I want, by way of paradox, to reflect on two different modes about the earth and earth itself and the human act of inscription, drawing, and storytelling. So I want us to tell one of the stories that I'm going to introduce in Istanbul, which is from Christine Taylor Patton. She writes, "One of my teachers told us to bring a drawing to class next day to bring a line. Yes, a single line. one of the students concocted a great apparatus that resembled the Rube Goldberg contraption that had all sorts of moving parts and managed to make a path across a piece of paper that he placed on the floor, and it drew a pencil line as it crossed in front of us, right before our eyes. I brought a live worm on a pile of sand. I liked the multi-leveled aspect of that. The worm was a line itself, and as it moved in the sand, it drew all the way through class time. Its aliveness brought time into the equation, as did the man-made Rube Goldberg drawing machine. We got to see lines being made, some locked in time, some not. I thought a lot about those lines over the years because as I passed through painting and clay and then foam sculptures that one could get into, I kept scratching little lines all over the place, looking for what happens when it did that, where the abstract qualities of space and time took me when I was playing so. I kept wanting to go swimming in those lines, into the crevices and pockets, into the vastness of the empty spaces. I loved seeing the light that got trapped, and the idea that my little scratches seemed to me more a way of manipulating the light, blocking it out, to see what was there, hidden in the paper, covered up by all that light, all that white space. Drawing is the examination of movement and feeling, made material, the materializing of the evanescent and the ephemeral, locked into a part of its being. What is seen on paper is a moment of the drawing's being, an illusory state, its other processes buried beneath the surface, hidden now, forming its substance. To understand structure and movement better, and how we perceive it, and how it has some connection to human beings, I started folding paper to find out about movement, the movement of light mostly, how it crossed paths with the various planes of the paper. I'd been fascinated with the simplest of relationships, the subtleties and hidden activities of points of intersection. Change, that's what all this is about, observing change and trying to understand it, trying to see what it reveals in new languages. And then, more or less to come to one almost end, a second quote from Karen Blixen to remind us that the other theme that has to be taken on board in Karolin Christoph Bakaliev's sense of the history, which I've tried to give you also of Istanbul, is trauma. That we are living in a period of terrible conflict, terrible trauma, terrible agony, that much of the 20th century has been caused by the unresolved business of the 20th century. So she writes, all sorrows can be born if you put them into a story or tell a story about them. I'm not so sure about that. I've just worked on trauma in the sense that you cannot necessarily narrate, but you can touch on it. But it opens onto the final element of this introduction that you need to have around where she gets the idea of a thought form from. So if salt water we can make sense, it has to come from a rather curious part of the history of the 20th century that everybody in the history of modern art is extremely embarrassed about. Now, lots of the artists at the beginning of the 20th century were not embarrassed in their search for some sense of some way beyond materialism, whether it was the materialism of new science or the materialism of new capitalism. And there is an extraordinary eruption of interest in the occult. People go to seances, people use films to try and capture bits of people's auras. Conan Doyle believes that there are fairies and things, etc. But there is an engagement with deep and long elements of esoteric knowledge that comes from Jakob Böhm, comes all the way through Swedenborg, the long tradition in the West, but also the way that this existed in non-European cultures, in Hindu culture and Indian culture. And the figure of Annie Besant is obviously going to be central to Karolin Christoph Bakaliev's exhibition in a curious way, because she traversed the Europe and Asia. And maybe you don't know anything about her, but she started off as the daughter of a vicar. She became one of the first atheist socialists agitating for secular struggle. She was absolutely at the forefront of the women's movement and struggle. She was a major activist for Home Rule for Ireland, which got us into a lot of hot water with the British. And then she went to India as she began to be interested in escaping from the limitations of the kind of opposition between sort of Christian religious orthodoxy and a kind of socialist atheism, which she registered didn't meet something of the yearnings that she had within her. So she went to India, and she studied with Hindu scholars and Hindu traditions of the esoteric and the spiritual, and in fact died eventually in India. But she then became one of the major activists working with Gandhi in terms of promoting home rule or independence for India. So an extraordinarily interesting character to traverse some of the struggles that we now know of from the late 19th century through to the early 20th century. And in her writing, she became involved with the Theosophists, and we are going to have a session on Annie Besant to dig up all the stuff that's in the university library. So our next event on the 20th of May is going to be bringing some scholars who worked with the impact of Theosophy and Annie Besant and this sort of intersection with socialism, feminism, liberation, politics and Theosophy that we've lost. But they also created this notion of art form, of thought forms, as which link up with the emergence of abstract art. So this is a thought form from listening to Gounod, to the French composer Gounod. I'm not sure what this is a thought form for, but as you can see, and some of the exercises and thought forms are really fascinating. This is, I think, rage or anger. But it had a huge impact on Kandinsky, who read it and wrote this Über das Geistige und der Kunst, on the spiritual in art, but also with some of the other figures who should be in our history of modern art. And this is Hilda af Klint, who is a Swedish artist who made her living painted pretty landscapes, but is one of the earliest people to explore abstraction and the very question of form as itself a means of communication. They were all influenced by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who was a Russian aristocrat. And I thought, when I found this little drawing, she was a visitor, but it's a little saltwater drawing just for that. This is the only catalogue done in 1987 that actually traces how many artists of the beginning of the 20th century were involved with Blavatsky and obviously with Theosophy. So when we come to think about what might happen at Istanbul, we're all sitting in kind of open anticipation of how politics, history, genocides, beating up students last 2 summers ago in the park, Erdogan trying to make himself the new kind of caliph, at the same time ISIS on its shores, Putin pushing down, etc. We've got this huge political history, but we've also got a sense of the brilliant traditions of Istanbul in its place in the world, and the question of how saltwater can be a thought form and how it relates to not the kind of transformation of art that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century with the origins of abstraction, but how artists now, such as Grace and others, are beginning to create different kinds of forms, in a sense for practice, to engage with and resonate with the things that Caroline Christoph-Bakagiev has set out as a possible kind of invitation. So I'm going to stop there, you'll be glad, but I hope I've given you enough to understand why those of us who have access to this sort of are so interested in what might happen if you went to an art exhibition like this, not just to kind of tick off, I've seen, the latest sort of hot numbers. It won't be that. There will be a team of artists she's worked with for 20 years, her own sort of core of artists that she has supported, as well as artists who are invited because the alliances have been allowed to make suggestions, but also because through working with commissioning agents or commissioning organizations such as Pavilion, becoming aware of other artists who are going to kind of be the next great thinkers in this developed form. Okay, so I don't know if there are any questions you'd like to have. I don't know, has that arrived yet? No. Okay, so we're going to have tea and coffee so that you can recover from having had to listen for a certain... But if there are any questions, and then we'll break for tea and coffee, and then Grace will take over the making with side of it and talk about her work, and then we'll have another little pause, and then she and I will be in conversation to see how the two elements of the day so far can come together for you, and obviously you hopefully will bring them together as well. So is there anything anybody wants to ask? Yes?
I have a question. How is Caroline going to negotiate between the local and the international? Are there going to be people from Istanbul involved, from Turkey, and kind of international artists?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Let me give you two examples. She's working closely with writers, poets, playwrights, and artists. So, interestingly, Sarkis, who is the kind of the is an Armenian artist, is one of the big sort of giants of Turkish modernism. He's going to be involved, but so is his daughter going to be involved in it, Elvan Zabunyan. But he is actually being featured in the Turkish pavilion in Venice. So there's a bit of a kind of conversation going on there. But the other way I would see it, which is that when Caroline had the sort of launch, the press conference that launched the event, she set it up so that the audience was on the stage. They were all set up on the stage, and the speakers were in the stalls. And she set it up as a kind of reverse cabaret because she did it in honor of Harun Kardar, who is the founder of Cabaret in the 1920s in Turkey. So again, at this point of modernization of Turkey, the notion of the cabaret as this ironic, parodic, politically incorrect form of kind of commentary on society. So they re-performed one of his, while also including a young Italian artist who's just written a one-act play called, and I can't remember the name of the place, but it's called We Were All Communists. So she sort of set this up to create conversations, not by saying, okay, here's a local and here's a not local, but in a sense, here's this thematic of the cabaret, of all sorts of different performers reaching back to the moment of the modernization of Turkey, which is what's at stake now in contemporary Turkish politics and things, but through the figures of the key Turkish artists and Turkish thinkers, but showing how they intersect with and have conversations. So instead, it's not that we've got the national, here's an Italian and here's a Turkish artist, but here's the grounds of certain forms, like the cabaret, or the architectural, or the sort of thematics, which can avoid international as if it's not national, because everything is grounded in place and time and history, but it's not got a flag on it. So it's that play with how do you have a sense of recognizing locality, but not this is local because international is the super one and local is just provisional. And it's part of the struggle I think we're having in Leeds, you know, how to create a space where, even though, you know, we are not London, you know, we are not Paris, we're not Berlin, but all sorts of things intersect across time and space around migration, politics. I was going to say, I mean, Leeds has fresh waterways, doesn't have, because we're landlocked, you know, etc., different kinds of ways. So how do you deal with that? So you don't simply have globalization being this international art world just jet setting in a kind of supersphere that never touches the ground, or is very supercilious or patronizing to local artists. You have to create a different ground in which somebody will not say, okay, ticking off the nationalities, but who will come from this place and speak of it, but also where there will be waves or connections or lines that would weave different kind of conversations around this space, in a sense, but around the modern in a way, around which is what we are seeing unraveling politically on a geopolitical stage, but also that we're trying to question some of the elements of it, particularly through this expanded conversation with science, and the thing that I'm most challenged by in relation to Caroline, which is why I put these books a little bit down out of sight, but they are there, about I'll pick them up so we can see them. Vibrant Matter, you know, and A Political Ecology of Things by Jane Bennett. I haven't got my Margulis with me, but Karen Barad, who is a feminist philosopher of physics, comes from physics, called Meeting the Universe Halfway, Quantum Physics and the Entanglement of Matter and Meaning. So these are equally reference points for her, which mean the national and the geopolitical is a matter of indifference when you're worrying about the substance of matter, the movement of plates, the forces of the water, you know, the things in the world. So she has a very expanded sense, and then the local disappears on the other side because it's planetary or earth-based or water-based. Anything else anybody wants to ask or say or comment or? Yeah?
Do you ever deal with the HMI in town? Because that seems like a pretty kind of progressive kind of place, isn't it, for ideas and art and things? Is it or not?
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right to bring that in. And clearly, it's been an enormous addition to the Leeds community to have the Henry Moore there. With their very specific sense of being focused on the advancement of understanding of sculpture. Obviously, sculpture has expanded to the point at which it actually can encompass everything, but they are still very focused on a particular mission around understanding sculpture, grounded in the history of modern sculpture. So they are enabling us to see things that we would otherwise not see and run fantastically interesting conferences around that. But they're not, as it were, I mean, what we're seeing is the difference between people who have collections or missions or museums which may show contemporary art, and this temporary exhibition, which is now the major way that we get a hold of what's actually going on. I mean, the temporary exhibition has taken over from the museum. So the beginning of the 20th century, in order for anybody to get an understanding of modern art, you had to make a museum of modern art, which then Gertrude Side said, you know, this is the end. How can you have a museum of modern art? But that's the model we had. Whereas starting with the Venice Biennale in 1895, there's this notion that somehow a temporary exhibition every so many years could give us this kind of snapshot. Because we can't say, I mean, even if you go to the Henry, you know, their exhibitions will situate it to say, okay, this belongs in this movement, or this is what was happening, you know, when like Marisa Merz or Mario Merz, you know, this is Arte Povera, this is what's happening in Italy in the 1950s and 60s, or this is what's, you know, this artist is, you know, like the Gago exhibition, you know, this was happening in Venezuela in the 1960s and 70s. Whereas if we want to know what's happening now, it's happening so fast, it's changing so fast, and the volume of it means nobody could say, oh, right, major movement, this is the one we need to put in next. There are no movements, there are no styles. You know, there's no outstanding artists. The market is trying to give us the outstanding, but they're not necessarily the same people. And this is another way. So this is a very new way in which we encounter the creative energy of our own time. So the temporary exhibition goes with the notion of contemporary art.
I think it goes with the rise of the curator as well. The rise of the curator as thinker, and the relationship between the artist and the curator becomes a really important addition to the models you've been telling us, because it is the model now, in one sense. These exhibitions don't come about without a certain regime of curatorship and international curatorship. So I think that's important, because curating is a thinking tool now. It isn't in the hands of somebody like Karen. It isn't in the hands of everybody. In a sense, that becomes an organising structure for the artists that we might find interesting, might want to look at. But, I mean, they are chosen, and it is a curatorial project in a sense.
Yes, so we you know, that's why...
You know, it's a big part of it now. So.
So you have, I mean, now we don't think about, you know, is it Picasso or Matisse? You go to an exhibition and you know that it's Ocui and Wezo or Caroline Christopher-Bagiev, or in fact, Nicolas Bourriaud curated the Taipei Biennale 2014-2015. Very interestingly, having a conversation with Caroline Christopher-Bagiev by us reasserting the importance of the human and relationality focused on the human, whereas she's trying to undo that. So that's partly why I thought it'd be interesting to do a project in Leeds as to what is this stuff. We haven't got one yet. Maybe we'll have a Leeds, you know, triennial or biennial or something at some point. We might set it up, etc. But that's what it is, and I think you're absolutely right, Alison. The curator rather than the institution. And they travel and they take over.
Because the curator is taken over from the museum, because you just have to look at the Tate situation at the moment. They've lost 12 curators of modern and Britain. And, you know, the project will be from those curators. The museum will now have to find out what it's going to do. You know, so I think it's really interesting because it's the curators that are circulating through those institutions.
But it should be said that that's why Caroline Christopher-Bagiev does not want to be thought of as a curator, because it becomes like a kind of, you're a choreographer or an impresario, or even the author, where she calls herself a director, drafting with these alliances, and trying, as it were. I think it'd be interesting to see what your experience is, how you develop something with the artists, not saying, here's my project, you know, can you fit in? Yes, Brenda? Yes,
a more theoretical question, maybe. I was wondering whether salt water is somehow in conversation with Zygmunt Bauman's liquid modernity, because I was immediately kind of, you know, thinking of his concept. Is that a response, a kind of more grounded, planetary sort of response to, although his concept was not, you know, about globalization only, but in terms of, you know, is there a certain relationship? Just wondering.
My hunch is Bauman is not part of Caroline Christopher-Bagiev's sort of working sort of library and resources and conversations. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is that the question of salt water is specific to the ocean and the sort of transport systems and the sort of maritime world and the sense of trade and connection that pre-exists any other form of transport. Before we started flying over the air or putting, you know, iron rails across the ground, we could either walk or sail, and that was I think crucial. So I think there's something very profound in passage and trade and that. But I think also this question of the saltiness of our bodies. I think it goes back to, maybe you'll say something about why salt is fascinating and interesting as an element of it. For those who don't know, liquid modernity is the proposition that, from a sociologist, that at the modernity involves breaking with the past. So it attempted to overthrow, like the French Revolution overthrew a monarchy and put in place a republic. And so there's a period of fluidity between, or liquidity between, the solid form of one political system and what comes in its place. And therefore you have a sense that we have, periodically we sort of unfreeze the fixed and it becomes fluid. Whereas what Bauman says is what's happening to us is nothing is replacing anything, but we are endlessly in a state of flux, that there is continuing change, which is a creature of modernity, but change for no actual direction. We're not going towards a communist state, we're not going towards a utopia. We just find that, you know, we have to buy another iPhone, or, you know, our clothes are immediately out of date, or, you know, there's a sense that there's just a constant destabilization, even to the point that our relationships are now, you know, you don't just meet somebody and then say, oh, I don't like that, I have another person, but you're kind of expecting to be constantly, you you know, relationships are fluid, our bodies are sufficiently fluid that we could even have his thing that he really loves is the loyalty card for cosmetic surgery, right? It's not like, I just don't like this, I'll change this and then I'll be happy. Well, once I start, well, I could change, you know, I could, you know, go through it, you know, all different bits of my... So there's a sense of a very different kind of ethos. But I think Carolyn is still, in some sense, a modernist thinker and trying to rethink something of those legacies in a way. She's, that was my feeling, but it's an interesting question. But I think scientifically, there's a difference between fluidity, what water is as a fluid force, and the relationship of liquidity to solidity, which passes by means of a gaseous state. So I think we need a scientist there because they're not quite the same. So Luce Rigore will talk about fluidity as a metaphor, but liquidity has a particular physical relationship to solidity rather than to what I think, you know, the fluid and the movement and the waves. Is the tea there? Okay, I'm going to release you now to have a cup of tea or coffee. So please rejoin us in about 15 minutes and we'll hand over to Grace to talk. Okay?